Let's get started. My name is Céline Castet-Renard. I'm a law professor at the Civil Law Faculty at the University of Ottawa, and I'm the co-supervisor with Professor Karine Gentlet, of this axis of OBJA. The axis is on humanitarian action, international relations, and human rights. And today we are very glad to welcome Eleonore Fournier-Tombs, who is a member of this axis, and we also receive Robert Trigwell, and I'm gonna let them introduce themselves. And this topic today, our topic today for this webinar is on regulating AI in the international humanitarian sector. And our guest proposed to consider approaches, challenges, and solutions. And we're very honored and glad to receive them. And I let you the floor, maybe first to Eleonore and after Robert, to introduce yourself. And after that, Eleonore could start.
Thank you, Céline. Hi, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. My name is Eleonore Fournier-Tombs, and I'm a data scientist who's worked primarily in international organizations. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, working with Céline in the research chair on accountable AI in a global context. And in that context, I'm the director of the Inclusive Technology Lab.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Trigwell. I'm a humanitarian aid professional, having worked in humanitarian operations across Africa, East Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. I currently work for the International Organization for Migration, and I'm the Data Responsibility and Ethics Officer, and I lead a number of IOMs, data science, but also data responsibility work streams. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for being here today. So today we're going to talk about the theme of regulating AI in the international humanitarian sector. So what I want to do is set the stage a little bit and talk about what regulation in the sector means and what are the different initiatives that are in place currently or are starting to develop in this area. Before I begin, what I wanted to do is define the humanitarian sector a little bit. I know that not everybody here is very familiar with that term, but I think it really helps us to understand why AI is being explored in this area, how useful it can really be, and also some of the risks for which we might be interested in regulating in the coming years. So humanitarian aid is concerned with providing short-term relief in response to natural or man-made disasters. And so it can address sudden onset disasters, which could be, for example, a big storm, a sudden, even man-made disaster like a coup d'etat or something, or chronic disasters like droughts would be a very good example. Some disasters are also recurring. So we have floods, for example, which come back. What we've experienced recently with health-related disasters, epidemics, can be considered in the realm of humanitarian aid. In the UN sector, humanitarian aid is coordinated by a central office called the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And all of the different UN agencies involved in humanitarian aid are responsible for their own areas. So whether it's children and nutrition, which is UNICEF, food security, which is WFP, and so on. So each organizations has its own area, and humanitarian coordination involves the work together of all of these different organizations. There's also a lot of different actors, other actors, non-UN actors in the field. So whether they're international organizations, local NGOs, and so on, that are all involved when there are disasters. So what is AI in this sector? So there's a lot of as we know, AI is a very broad and very dynamic technology being used in a variety of different areas. And so two of the main areas in which AI technologies can be used in this sector are predictive analytics and biometric identification. And these are quite different technologies, but at the base, they use artificial intelligence technologies to work. So predictive analytics involves often the prediction of the movement of migrants or refugees. So this is actually really helpful in order to prepare for the arrival of refugees in a specific area. And so the humanitarian community finds these kinds of predictions very interesting because it allows for something called anticipatory action, meaning that we're going to raise money and prepare humanitarian aid ahead of time. Similarly, the prediction of humanitarian needs. So when there is a humanitarian crisis, what are the specific needs of the populations that are affected, whether it's food, water, shelter, first aid, those kinds of needs, using predictive analytics to know ahead of time is found very, very useful. And we've seen in the last year and a half that the prediction also of disease spread. So not only the spread or the severity of COVID-19 as a virus, but a lot of other viruses or diseases that can happen in humanitarian contexts. For example, waterborne illnesses are often explored in the context of predictive analytics. Then we have a completely different category of artificial intelligence technologies, which is biometric identification. So the use of facial recognition systems to match and develop an identification system for people in situations of migration or refugees, whether it's facial recognition, it could be also iris scans or fingerprinting. This is used to facilitate the distribution of social assistance. It can also be used for visa management or refugee asylum case management in situations of extreme precarity. Sometimes maintaining a clear document tracking system is complicated. And so there's been a lot of work in terms of exploring whether or not biometric identification could be useful in this context. And it's used in a number of contexts in the field. So over the last few years, there's been a lot of investment in these areas in the humanitarian sector. There's a number of research labs, whether they are within the UN system or outside of the UN system, that really focus on data and on the development of predictive models. A lot of them are focused on proofs of concepts. So researching and exploring different possibilities in terms of using artificial intelligence in this sector. And coming up with new solutions that could be integrated into the process or the flow of humanitarian aid. There's a lot of innovation developed throughout this sector as well. And the idea is once some of these concepts have been proven, that they can be potentially deployed as well. We've seen a growth as in public-private partnerships. So a number of companies that develop AI globally, whether they're large AI companies or smaller consultancies, have partners also with humanitarian organizations to provide artificial intelligence solutions. So we know that the growth of these technologies also require a certain type of expertise, and expertise that is not always found inside public institutions or inside nonprofits. And so private organizations have come in to provide that expertise, to provide that hardware as well, in order to deploy some of these solutions in the field. So the question is, in the face of so much innovation and potential, why would we want to regulate? So I showed these images. The pharmaceutical industry is one of these, what represents these pills, and the aviation industry. just to show that when as a society we develop very powerful technologies, it's very natural eventually to want to regulate these technologies in order to enhance their positive effects on society and to mitigate the risks. And so AI, as I know, a number of people here know, is weakly regulated at the moment. So it's a technology that has enormous amount of potential applications, not just in the humanitarian sector, but throughout a multitude of sectors, and very transformative potential. However, it's very powerful, and the damaging impact that it can have when it's not used appropriately is very high. And so just like any other powerful industry, like pharmaceutical industry or like the aviation industry, it's important to start to consider how we're going to mitigate these risks so that we only promote positive and safe uses of artificial intelligence. So one of the most, most important initiatives in AI regulation at the moment is a proposal published by the European Commission in April, which took a risk-based approach to artificial intelligence. So it categorized AI systems as low risk, high risk, and prohibited technologies, and developed a system of certifying artificial intelligence technologies before they were deployed, so that they can be verified and fully certified, just like any other technology, before the public has access to it. What really interested me in examining this regulation proposal was that it excluded international organizations, which is, by the way, completely normal in international law. There's no expectation that the European Union would have jurisdiction on an international organization. But it's interesting to consider that the EU would eventually have these categorizations for use of AI, categorizations that have overlap with the kind of AI that's also being used in the humanitarian sector. For interest, I'm not proposing that these prohibited technologies are used in the humanitarian sector, but for interest, there's a series of prohibited technologies, so uses of AI that would not be permitted in the European Union at all. Techniques that that manipulate people's behavior without their knowledge, techniques that exploit their vulnerability, techniques that provide a social scoring to evaluate the trustworthiness of certain persons, and certain types of real-time biometric identification. So these, to my knowledge, are not used in the humanitarian sector in any case. However, there's a list of high-risk technologies that have a justification to be used, that can prove to be useful, but that have some risks associated with them. So these are the types of technologies that under this regulation would be certified before they would be deployed. These include, so I've bolded the ones that I think are more relevant to our discussion today. These include other types of biometric identification. They include the access to and enjoyment of essential private and public services. So particularly determining whether or not an individual would be eligible to receiving social assistance. So that is a use of AI that's quite common, or increasingly common, and that could conceivably be used in a humanitarian sector to determine whether or not a person would be eligible to receive humanitarian aid. And then there's a category which involves migration, asylum, and border control management. So we can consider that anytime that we're dealing with populations that are in movement, migrants, and typically this is one of the effects of humanitarian crises, is that it causes migration or leads to migration. AI in relation to that would be considered high risk. And what does the certification process, what would it mean? So if this regulation is adopted, there's three main areas of certification that would be required before an AI system would be deployed. One is an extensive and detailed documentation of the algorithms used in the solution. considering potential biases, considering how they were developed, how transparent and explainable they are. The other one is the documentation of the data used. So is the data appropriate for the use case? Are there any biases in the data? So we know that AI systems can be biased because of improper training data. So there's the requirement of a certification and examination of the data that's being used in the AI system. And finally, a monitoring process. So how is the AI solution going to be monitored to make sure that it stays of high quality throughout its implementation? So we have, after the EU regulation, we have a new initiative, a different initiative, which is being spearheaded by UNESCO, and which is a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which should be published or released in December. The idea of this initiative is to set a standard for all United Nations member countries seeking to regulate artificial intelligence. So it's quite different from the European Union's risk-based approach in that it's a values-based approach. That means that it puts a lot of focus on what are the certain values that artificial intelligence technologies should promote, and spends less time detailing and mitigating the risks in the way that the other regulation or the EU regulation might be doing. So some of the values that it includes in this document are human rights. So in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, various conventions and documents at regional and national levels, making sure that AI protects those human rights, considerations of environmental, the environment, climate change, and biodiversity, diversity and inclusiveness in the development of AI systems, and living in harmony and peace, which could be considered more of security and peace building, making sure that AI technologies do not promote conflict, for example. Within that context, certain principles are underscored, some of which have overlap with the EU regulation. For example, safety of AI solutions, their privacy, non-discrimination, explainability of AI systems. So the idea is that these values in any case have already been developed by the international community, by different countries in terms of important or critical items in our society, or principles in our society that should not be adversely affected by any technology, let alone by AI. So we return to them and we explore what are certain principles in the development of AI that would ensure that these values are not affected. And finally, there's a recent report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which was released in September, which combines the two. So it combines the risk-based approach with some clarity on certain values. Particularly, it focuses on human rights, and particularly the right to privacy in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 12, and details the risks of artificial intelligence technologies to privacy in particular. And so it combines, it details certain concerns where, again, we see overlap with the EU Commission regulation and also some uses in the humanitarian sector, and makes clear recommendations, including regulation, including consideration of how to appropriately manage public-private partnerships in order, and makes these recommendations again to member states. So we have these three kind of high-level documents that have come out recently. There's also been other reports written by a number of different organizations that at a broader level talk about the values and the ethics of artificial intelligence and detail some risks and vulnerabilities, in particularly when dealing with vulnerable populations or in situations where there's already discrimination. A lot of these instruments are not necessarily trickling down to the actions of data scientists in the humanitarian sector. And so that's where a different kind of tool comes in, which Robert Trigwell is going to speak more about, which is the notion of the ethical framework. I put an image of grass here because for me, this is more of a grassroots approach. So as opposed to the other approaches that are much more high level, the development of, I guess, a phenomenon in the humanitarian sector, which is the ethical framework, is a grassroots initiative that's often developed by data managers, data scientists, people that have been working on these technologies and have observed firsthand a gap in terms of standards and rules in which they might operate in a more comfortable way. And I think that these tools are extremely powerful in that they're very concrete. They provide a set of rules that in a certain context can be applied by different groups. And they are used quite quickly. So as opposed to a regulation that might take several years to be used or be implemented, the ethical framework is often deployed very quickly because in and of itself, it diminishes risk of the operation and is quite desirable for data scientists or data managers in the field. The difficulty, of course, is that it doesn't necessarily have legal standing. So having a broader adoption of the tool or developing a tool that can then be reused by other organizations, I think is a challenge in and of itself. And that's why I think that one of the efforts and maybe one of the purposes in having this discussion today is to bridge these specific guidances with higher level principles. So how can we link the two, make sure that in the development of these higher level principles, we take account of these very powerful and useful grassroots initiatives, and maybe give them a little bit more power and regulatory teeth in terms of being able to be implemented. So that's really what I'm hoping to discuss with everyone today is, I guess, bringing the bridge down in this analogy and connecting these two disparate initiatives in the regulation of AI so that we have a more seamless and useful process in humanitarian aid. So thank you so much. And I'm going to now let Robert speak about a really wonderful initiative by IOM.
Thank you, Eleonore. Now I'll just start to share my screen. Yeah, hi all. So yes, as mentioned, I'm going to go over some work of what the IOM developed a few years ago now. But to give a bit of background to why I'm talking about this, I'll just kind of explain a bit more about the team that I'm part of. So I work for the UN Migration Agency, so better known as the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and more specifically, I work within the team of the Displacement Tracking Matrix, the DTM. The DTM team is, we're a network, well, we're a global project that is active in 86 high mobility countries. And we have a network of coordinators in each country with information management, GIS mapping support teams, as well as field coordinators and data enumerators, as well as key informants. So our job is to really collect information of areas of high mobility. So mostly in internal displacement contexts, such as in northern Ethiopia and Tigray right now, or in Nigeria or in Afghanistan. Collect primary data through really kind of face-to-face dialogue with affected communities and affected individuals, and provide actionable information for the wider humanitarian system. So Eleanore presented in, I think it was the second slide, there was like a kind of a pizza diagram with UNICEF and WHO. So that's the cluster system, and the DTM is designed to kind of give the information to the various parts of the kind of humanitarian coordination system, so decisions and actions can be made. In the last 10 years, the sector has kind of gone through some quite big change in terms of data. More and more agencies are now collecting it. The kind of the paradigm shift from paper to mobile data collection platforms and crowdsourcing has led to a lot more data being available. It's often now to a much larger quality due to emphasis on data collection initiatives and capacity training. There's been big actions on interoperability as well, so common structuring, so making sure different data sets talk to each other better, and also access. So you can go onto online data repositories like the DTM website, or the more kind of mainstream ones such as OCHA's Humanitarian Data Exchange, better known as HDX. And you can be anywhere in the world and you can download enormous amounts of data regarding various humanitarian situations. 10 years ago, if you wanted to know the locations of displacement sites in a context, you very likely would have had to be kind of like in a meeting with a USB pen and kind of have a discussion after and kind of get access. And now we can download it anywhere, and a really rich data set. And the DTM is there to kind of inform humanitarian actions and decisions, and we're a humanitarian organization. And I'm very pleased that Eleanore mentioned the UNESCO work, because that's very kind of UN-wide, very kind of big picture. But from now on, I'm going to speak very specifically to the kind of the humanitarian component of the UN, which is just one piece. So because of something we started to notice a couple of years ago with the rising popularity of AI, machine learning, predictive analytics, remote sensing, we started to kind of see, and because we could also track where our data sets were being downloaded, because we make everything online and we can check the analytics, we were seeing our kind of data go further afield than we may have originally thought. And when I say we, I think that would probably be fair for the wider humanitarian community, but I'm speaking more specifically about DTM. But we were seeing, big interest in part of the world where we may not have any DTM operations. So it was quite clear that people were using our data kind of beyond maybe the traditional type of stakeholders that we were partnering with, kind of before the turn of the last decade. So in 2018, an informal group of kind of data collection agencies, some ethics advocates, some humanitarian practitioners, we kind of got together because we knew that the phenomenon we were seeing was not unique to kind of one organization, but it was more system wide. This much bigger interest. So we established this informal group called the Data Science and Ethics Group, the DSEG, and it was deliberately aimed at kind of putting together kind of multidisciplinary understandings of kind of what is like humanitarian data science ethics, should we say. And we see it as the overlapping juncture of kind of four main areas, which is humanitarian principles and standards. We adhere to humanitarian principles, humanitarian innovation, AI ethics, and of course, data responsibility. And kind of that encompasses what we've defined as a group, what kind of humanitarian data science and ethics is. So we did a number of discussions with a number of stakeholders in this over about a year period, and we kind of mapped out some key opportunities and some key challenges that were happening or were of concern or were on people's kind of minds when it comes to this particular discussion. And we identified the kind of the big things we wanted to work on was peer review, or the lack of. Unlike academia, we see lots of humanitarian research projects done by NGOs and the UN, and there's very often there's very often never a peer review process in that. Accountability, so who is accountable? Is it a data science developing the code? Is it a project manager that wanted to push an innovative program? Is it the donor funding said program? Communications, so we have to deliver aid to extremely vulnerable populations. Often we don't have enough humanitarian aid to go around, so we have to target. It's hard enough targeting as it is with current methods, but if we're using more complex methods, how do we communicate that? Inclusivity, there was the World Humanitarian Summit a couple of years ago now, and a big push from that was being more inclusive with governments and local society, civil society, and local organizations. And if we're kind of going a more kind of advanced data science route, does it affect that kind of inclusivity? And of course, transparency. How do you make this entire process transparent? That led to the development of the framework that's on the left. And we try to cover that. But one thing we initially found out, is that we went into this thinking technical peer review will take a lot of the accountability or relieve a lot of the accountability worries of the data scientists. And then we started to realize that it's not just a technical discussion, it's an ethical discussion, it's a practical discussion, where may not said tools be useful, and also a legal discussion. However, we deliberately left the legal discussion out of this because of international immunity, like Eleanor mentioned, and this is a guidance tool. And even when you see with GDPR, with it changing so often, the need to kind of continuously evolve. So we deliberately left the legal aspect out of this, purely focusing on the ethical, practical, and technical. This led us to these 5 steps. Fundamentals, and we've deliberately put this as step 0 because any project should be based on kind of humanitarian principles, kind of human rights, and then we've added some extra data science specific ones like AI ethics. But rather than seeing that as a step in the process, we thought all projects should be kind of built on top of it. Hence why we kind of put it as step 0 as the foundation. Problem recognition and solution exploration. So something we don't do enough in the sector really is problem recognition. We're actually properly identifying what the problem is before we have thought about any solution for it. So rather than coming with an app or coming with an algorithm, we say, what is the solution? What is the solution? What is the problem that we're dealing with? Is it a fact that we are trying to quantify displacement numbers in an area that we can't access because of security issues? Okay, so then what's the solution around that? Maybe we can count shelters from a satellite image. So, or is the problem something that a data science project may not be applicable for? And then therefore we kind of don't even have to go any further. But it's really based around kind of some key concepts of humanitarian innovation, is like have a full sound understanding of the problem and then find the right solution for it, rather than having this kind of techno solutionism kind of approach. And then from there on, the data journey, the algorithm, and the reliance on outputs is very much kind of to do with some of the more technical aspects of a data science project. But step 0 and step 1 is basically applicable to any project, data science or not. So this was kind of the steps of the framework, but it's designed for practitioners in the field, because right now, as Eleanor mentioned, we don't have any kind of interagency standards or regulations. So this is like an interim. We're not a formal network or an organization to set standards. So we were like, okay, as an interim, we wanted to create some sort of guidance that people could use, because AI has become very popular and there's an expectation to adopt certain methods when and where. But let's do it properly. But there's no current standard setting on how to do it right now. So we don't want people kind of going left, right, and center. So we developed this kind of framework to people could work within in almost the absence of standards. As I mentioned, this is kind of deliberately being catered for colleagues in the field. So a 50-page ethical framework might be a bit heavy. So we translated it to something called a decision tree, which is an interactive tool. that project teams can basically navigate through over a period of time. It could be in a very long day, or maybe over the course of a week, but it's to cover the key steps that we and a network have identified as some of the key things to consider when developing a humanitarian project with a data science component. And if you see the color-coded box on the left, then they're exactly the same as the stages in the framework. So it's a direct translation. And this is like a map of the tree. And here, hopefully you can see my cursor. So you basically have to follow a set of steps. It's a bit more complex than yes and no, and I'll show you in just a moment. But it's basically, because if a data scientist may be solving one of these problems, maybe concepts of humanitarian principles or human rights might be not their strength. Or if you're coming from a humanitarian background, likewise for some of the data science concepts. And the idea is that by going through the key steps that we've gone through, sort of fundamentals, some of the key steps of problem recognition and searching for solutions, and then the algorithm checks, consent, is there secondary data, team diversity, as well as over here to do with the algorithm work, and then output work. We feel that if a program team goes through these key steps, then hopefully a lot of the considerations that you would want someone to have when they're developing a humanitarian data science project, then that project team would have gone through them. So this is by no means a standard, it's by no means a regulatory guide, it's purely a process that is somewhat facilitating a team in the absence of standards or regulation. And so what we can do here, so there's a website that we can go on, and you can create an account, you can add information about your project, and then essentially you can, I'm hoping this works, and then you can essentially go through the decision tree here. And this is just a really short video where you can see that basically rather reading page after page, you can enter the tree and you can say, okay, I know about this, I don't know about that. And whenever you say you don't know about it, then you have a big collation of resources that point you in the right direction to learn more. So it could be about humanitarian principles and core humanitarian standards. Maybe you're pretty sharp on data management, so you can skip it or not, or you can go through, and it gives you the key documents. And this way, there's multiple phases to a data science project. It's not just about kind of like building the algorithm, it's also about the kind of data protection and security, how we present the results, how we present margin of error, who is involved in the development, how do we communicate this, is it based on to inform action. So that's kind of really what the tree's about. And then obviously you can finish, and then we can it uploads to the repository onto the website, and you can list as public. Obviously, certification is part of the process, and something that we're really happy that we saw this year is that the Humanitarian Grand Challenge that I believe is hosted by the Canadians said in their portfolio, because it's a humanitarian innovation fund, so obviously they're starting to get more and more kind of AI, machine learning projects. And one thing, what they listed in their funding proposal was that basically, if you're going to develop a humanitarian data science project, please run through the decision tree. So it was zero funding from them, but it was great endorsement of and that's why we added the certificate, because then you can kind of almost proven that you've thought about, I think, the 67 steps that a network of 120 people have thought about. That okay, if we're going to do a project, let's think about this step, this step, this step, this step, this step. Obviously, you can skip, of course, and it's kind of trust, but at least you can say you've gone through the process and you've thought about some steps that maybe your team of data scientists or maybe your team of humanitarian practitioners may not have originally thought at the beginning. And then part of this is that one thing we're developing now is that anyone that goes through the tree, you can then upload online, and there'll be essentially a library of humanitarian AI projects. And that's another thing that I feel is beneficial for the communities, because it's not just about kind of guidelines and standards, but it's also about learning what other people are doing, and collaborations and kind of complementary projects, or reducing duplication as well. So yeah, and then so just a few kind of processes we did on the decision tree is that we ran it through the NetHope AI working group, which is a kind of quite an active group on speaking about AI in the humanitarian sector, as well as the global information management working groups. And then we received input from various number of kind of NGOs, UN, academia, policy, as well as private. So yeah, so that's, so I'll stop sharing now, but just to kind of reiterate or to complement what Eleanor said, is that I think a big question is, like, in the absence of regulation and in the absence of standards, but then what do you do? Because the world is innovating, there's an expectation for innovation, but if we don't put these frameworks in place, or these kind of, I'm trying to avoid the term interim solutions, then there's a lot of damage that can be done at the beginning that would have to kind of go back. And I feel like we saw this a lot with the around the 2010 era, where the humanitarian sector kind of datafied a lot, and the lack of data safeguards in place that are in place now, it's night and day. So AI is still, in my opinion, it's still very much in its nascent stages, and it's in the humanitarian sector. So it's a good opportunity to get some kind of key ways of working maybe in place, whilst the more macro standards and regulations may come in place, but they may take a couple of years. And right now, the humanitarian sector is trying to innovate very quickly, particularly in certain methods like biometrics, or more popular like predictive analytics, anticipatory action, and predictive forecasting. And yeah, I'll pass it back to Eleanor or Celine. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Eleonore. It was really interesting, insightful. We already have many questions, so I don't want to take to spend a lot of time and to take time. And I would like to let the audience ask that question. But first, I would like to ask to both of you. As we know, the use of AI is increasing, and there is no doubt with that. And as you said, Rob, there is no regulation right now, only principle on the ground. And because you are very aware of the risk, and I'm not sure that everybody, every data scientist on the ground is aware of them. And I was wondering what kind of regulation would you like to have? Do you think the EU regulation is the good way? And if a regulation is enacted, would enacted in the future, what kind of impact this regulation could have on the work of a data scientist, because both of you are data scientists. And also, I have several concerns as a legal scholar. Probably it's because of my position, but I was wondering what kind of accountability or liability would you like to have, and who should be held responsible? Do you think it's necessary to have an institutional responsibility versus an individual responsibility, and who should be responsible? And my last question is about the partnership between private and public sector, because we know it's a very it's something well known. We know that when there are some partnerships, usually the data protection is less important, and there are some gap in this area, and we can anticipate that there will have some gaps in the AI sector, and especially in the humanitarian action. And do you think if, let's say, if an international organization contract with a private company, do you think the private company should be guided or regulated specifically? Because of course there is a specific there are specific issues in the humanitarian actions, and of course humanitarian principles, as you know. So 3 questions. One on the regulation and the impact of your work, one on the liability and who should be held responsible, and one on the partnership, public-private partnership. Thank you.
Okay, I could start, but I'll try not to take too much time. So in terms of what's next for the regulation of AI in this sector, I think that there's a number of different solutions, but I definitely think that a solution coming from the UN in terms of an internal regulation. So for example, an internal standard. There's a lot of different standards used by the UN in the deployment of humanitarian aid, in the way in which it's done, the construction of refugee camps and the distribution of aid. I think going into that space and adding AI as an internal standard for the deployment of humanitarian aid with AI would be really useful. So because of the structure of international law, the UN has to regulate itself. And so that would be important. It can be done at the humanitarian level, and it can also be done at a UN-wide level. And I think both could be really interesting to explore. I feel really optimistic about the impact of regulation on AI initiatives in order to increase trust, to really help the deployment of quality solutions in a faster way, because I actually think that even though right now you can quickly develop an AI solution in the sector, deploying it in the field is extremely complicated because of trust and certification issues. So while this kind of regulation would maybe slow down the process, ultimately I think that we would have more success in deploying useful and high quality solutions in the humanitarian sector. I think public-private partnerships are important. I've spoken in my research to a number of private companies that offer services in the humanitarian sector. And I think that there is a need and even an expectation from the private sector of standards in terms of what they might adhere to. Some kind of certifications as discussed by Robert. Ideally, something very strict that the private companies could follow and certify in order to be allowed to sell their products to or donate their products to the humanitarian sector. I also think that there's a lot of power in ESG, so environmental, social, and governance indicators. Having or using those indicators in the AI sector and encouraging private companies to really communicate their own ESG and the ESG impact of their AI solution, I think would be really helpful. So I think we have a number of possibilities, but the requirement and the responsibility, I think, has to come to from a certain extent from the humanitarian community that has requirements in terms of the involvement and behavior of the private sector companies that it works with, not only in terms of the project, but also the overall footprint of the company. Because we've seen some cases where there's been public-private partnerships, the project seemed fine, but the company had other operations, other projects that might seem detrimental to human rights. And so that's a consideration as well. So I'll stop there and I'll let Robert share his thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. And thank you, Celine, for some super interesting and quite difficult questions. In terms of in terms of kind of where AI is going in the sector, I think we all kind of think about AI in more, what's the word, kind of complex uses. I think we're inevitably going to adopt kind of AI more and more in humanitarian organizations, because that's the way the world's going, and I think in what form it's invariably in what form do we adopt it. For example, screening of resumes in HR. Like I manage a team of 18 people. I sift through a load of resumes. I know some organizations have already adopted, looking for keywords. I think, if a newspaper was to do an article on how humanitarian organizations use AI, they're not going to talk about CV sifting. They're going to talk about understanding refugee and displacement routes, or how to predict cholera outbreaks in Camp A, B, C, and D. I know that some medical diagnoses, particularly I think by MSF, have been quite successful in this. And so I think a question about kind of how it's used, and I think as a result of how it's used and how it's regulated, is almost dependent on the use case. So, like, I'm assuming the risk of do no harm is a greater risk if you're predicting population movements in sensitive and political and dangerous context than if you were to looking for SQL in a resume if you were hiring a database manager. And I think like Eleanor, I'm actually very optimistic about this. I co-lead a group called the Data Responsibility Working Group. We just published under the Interagency Standing Committee, which is the governing body of the humanitarian sector, basically, data responsibility guidelines. We published them in February, and I think the humanitarian sector in the last couple of years, particularly the last 5 years, has become very aware about kind of data safeguarding and data risks, and there's just a natural kind of transition into kind of AI with that, particularly as more and more people kind of look more at how we use data more in advanced ways. I think regulation is a difficult one for the reasons Eleanor mentioned, and I think a lot of our programs in the sector, we kind of govern ourselves through common agreed upon standards. So we have core humanitarian standards, CHS, and we have standards like sphere standards. So if you're building latrines in a displacement camp, you have to build so many to this, really, I'm kind of summarizing, but you have to build so many per the ratio of the population, and these are agreed upon standards. So if you're in Myanmar, if you're in Nigeria, if you're in Yemen, there's kind of key set standards, and we almost like govern ourselves. So when donors come to these sites, they'll say, what's the standards there? It's not regulatory, but it's kind of like widespread adopted standards that have gone through years of consultations and iterations, but they're kind of like known as the go-to ones, in my opinion. So I think kind of having these set standards and frameworks based on kind of key principles, I think is probably a way we'll go. Regulation, I'm not too sure. Like legal, I'm not a legal expertise, but just based on like, data breaches and kind of data protection kind of modalities, we refer to our legal team, but it's always kind of based on, guidelines and kind of frameworks to do that. In terms of public-private partnerships, this is a super interesting one, actually. I think a little bit to what Eleanor said, I think the problem owners need to be in the lead of this, and by the problem owners, it's the humanitarians dealing with the problem. They're dealing with not having enough food and knowing to put it there, or there, or trying to give information about COVID to a country that may have 15 different languages being spoken. So should we use a bot in different languages? I think that the humanitarian organization needs to be in control of how the technology is used, and we need to design a solution. We need to design a solution around the problem and not around the tech. And this is kind of key because with the tech company and the humanitarian organization, if we kind of put the problem at the top, then it's almost kind of obvious how the power dynamic may be there. And then we need to develop, and in part of the partnership as well, we need to develop a common language, because communications between tech and aid experts are very different. Even the term protection would be very miscommunicated between a cybersecurity person, a lawyer, and a psychosocial project officer for the IRC. Just that one term is probably misinterpreted a few different ways. So kind of having this kind of common language, I think, is key for the partnership as well. But that being said, all that being said, like funding for AI, even though AI is popular at the moment, and I think it's just going to become more and more popular, funding for it is not very good, and it's in short supply. And as a result, you see lots of CSR. CSR is corporate. In the UK, we call it corporate social responsibility. So rather, say, a tech company giving funding, they may say, hey, we can give you 50 hours of our hotshot data scientist groups and to help you out. But we need to establish the right relationship. And, pro bono support and cash isn't always like the X factor. That's not always what there's more to it. I think we need to establish and maintain ethical partnerships and bring in critical expertise to the field. And I think that's a key part of the partnership as well. I don't think there's enough AI experts in the humanitarian sector for AI to properly take off in the humanitarian sector. So we have a lot to learn from the private sector. But how we kind of manage that engagement, I think, is key. It can't be a whitewash. It can't be a whitewash. It has to. The expertise has to be appropriately applied to the right solution, and then we can go into relationships with big tech companies. And then on that, if we are kind of buying kind of or outsourcing systems, then there's always procurement guidelines, and there's always a memorandum of understanding. So we can set kind of key kind of points in the contract that we go into these partnerships with, like points to adhere to. So obviously, kind of going back to standards, the more robust kind of interagency standards guidelines that we have, the more we can refer to a minimum ways of working when we go into contracts. You don't go into partnership with an organization without contracts. It's a professional sector. It's not a volunteer sector. So the more professional kind of points that we can refer to, the more that they can be like, okay, you have to operate to that minimum standard. And that's why I'm such an advocate for kind of interagency standards and guidelines, because even if we're not going to operate that way, the people helping us out will have to operate that way. Otherwise, we don't go into that partnership. And then just on accountability, this is a really good one. And this is a question that I've had many times with my team is, and this led to the actual establishment of the DSEG, is that we're IOM, DTM, we calculate and we quantify movement a lot. And the data scientist was trying to develop a model to understand displacement, so we could then collect our data and see how accurate they were, to see if basically a triangulation tool. A lot of the time we collect data in a data vacuum in very difficult context for security or whatever reasons, and we don't have any ways to triangulate the data, and that's scary because data is always wrong. It can be right, but you always want to cross check it, is what I meant. So, and the data scientist was like, if I predict movement from A to B and there's an intersect or there's a closure of a border, is that my fault? And I don't know. It's a really tough question, and I think, like how we see with data governance policies, where we, how we collect data, how we share data, how we govern data, is kind of like we have it in IOM as like a pyramid, where I think it spreads the accountability out based on certain kind of hierarchies, based on certain severities. And I think as AI becomes more mainstream, I think that's how, maybe there's kind of AI governance, or it falls under the data governance work, because saying a project manager who watches a Google AI for Good conference isn't at fault if something happens, nor should the data scientists be, or should the donors. It's like a collective. So if in the absence of governance models, it's very easy to kind of point fingers, when I would imagine if something bad was to happen, like a closure of a border because a population movement was identified for a model, it was never the intention. Or it was never the deliberate intention. But again, it's easy to point fingers if there are no kind of clear governance models of how that may have happened. So yeah, I think the accountability will should go through everyone involved really, and that's kind of, you know, in the DSEG decision tree we talk about team diversity. So if we have bias in a model because maybe we were looking at it from a very specific point of view because we only hired food security experts and we didn't hire any protection experts, then is that a failure of HR? Is it a failure of project manager? It's much more kind of complex than I think we all think. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I maybe jump into the question from the audience, if I may. And we have a very interesting question about in the Q&A about the misuse, and what would be for you, you know, the condition to avoid any misuse. Is it regulation, ethical framework? Is it, I love your idea of partnership and to work closely and to design a solution from the problem and not from the technology. So according to you, what will be the best condition to ensure that we don't have misuse? And we've seen that, and Koalam in the question said about tracking down and deportation. That would be, you know, very problematic issue if we go there, and if technology will be, you know, misused from its original function.
Do you want to take that one, Robert, and I can complete after?
Yeah, absolutely. So I understand the question is, how can predictive analytics ensure not to be misused? Okay, I mean, it's a great question, and this is a tangible example. This is a real life example that I think people doing predictive forecasting need to be aware of. And I think, you know, so here we need to think about going back to the ethical, the practical, and the technical aspect. So it might be technically possible to predict movement. It may have its operational usefulness, so practical, so it's practically appropriate. But ethically, there, like, you know, what we need to understand the risks of that. So maybe we can do it, but maybe their results shouldn't be public, for example. So if we're trying to inform, I don't know, if we're trying to identify kind of a route to support kind of a migrant corridor or a migrant caravan, sorry, or movement across the border, like we have to take all those things into consideration. And I think that's the worst nightmare of kind of any organization, is that if we were, you know, we're trying to be more predictive so we can be more prepared to respond, but then we expect a movement from A to B, and as a result, a border is closed to result, then, you know, that is a breach of do no harm. So I think how we communicate that, how we communicate the results. There's also aggregation methods. So if it's like purely like an academic study, we don't need to identify routes along a road. Maybe it could be from a region to a region. So the actual kind of detailed routes are hidden or aggregated. So it's much more non-sensitive. Yeah, I mean, oh, whoops. Yeah, so it's a really kind of and this is why I think there's a big debate on openness and access about results, and they're a little bit different. Like people working in this domain, you know, maybe not all the results should be public because we don't know how they're going to be misunderstood. For example, you know, migrant movements. If an agency A was collecting migrant movements towards Europe for humanitarian purposes, I mean, there's a lot of kind of anti-migrant rhetoric in certain parts of Europe at the moment, and they could use that information for non-humanitarian purposes. So maybe we should make steps so those particular stakeholders don't necessarily kind of have access to the data and the analysis, but the ones developing the kind of pro-migrant policies and the humanitarian operations probably should.
Yeah, I can jump in as well. I think that one of the tricky elements of working with migrants is a divergence of intents. So in the humanitarian sector, the objective is to save lives, is to increase the well-being and support migrants in a number of different ways. That's not necessarily the case for every other actor involved in dealing with migrants. So in the case of national governments, there can be positive actions on behalf of national governments, but there can also be some surveillance or tracking activities of undocumented migrants, for example. And so that is an intent of a national government that wouldn't necessarily be the same as an intent of a humanitarian organization. And then there's also, and that would not even necessarily be called a malevolent intent, in the sense that a national government often believes that it's in their right to track and deport undocumented migrants. Then there's maybe what we can call bad actors in a conflict who would not only want to track down migrants, but target them for some reasons. So whether it's for the purposes of ethnic cleansing, for the purposes of attracting child soldiers, or targeting women, trafficking, etc. So there's a variety of different intents, and it's important to be aware of that when you're working in that environment. AI doesn't necessarily change that reality, in the sense that I think anyone already operating in that environment has to operate under a certain level of concern and secrecy. The predictions done by AI models are one thing, but there's also predictions by qualitative analysts in the field or in other ways of obtaining information as well. So it's just to say that there's also a context in which AIs in the models are inserting themselves that already exists, in which it's a very precarious situation, particularly when you add conflict to a humanitarian crisis. So when you're with a natural disaster, the concerns might be less great than layers of conflict for migrants. That being said, I really agree with what Robert said, is that models used in that scenario definitely have to be protected. And so there's a really concern in terms of data protection and not only privacy, but cybersecurity, making sure that the data used, the models used, all of the predictions and the outputs are secure. And so I think that it's an important consideration in the development of this regulation. And I think we don't often talk about maybe cybersecurity as a really important element of AI ethics or ethical AI. But in this case, I think it often is the case.
Okay, thank you. And especially also maybe related to the question of the previous question was also that, an humanitarian issue can become a security issue. So, and then, the level of protection and the political game that is behind that is a little bit more complicated. Okay, I think Edine is going to talk.
Yes, so we're just going to jump on another question from Anas Khalil, who is asking, who governs the regulation of IA? Is there a central entity that governs this? And he also asked, or is it a proof of concept? And if I can just add to his question, I want to know, in the case in the case where it is an international entity that governs that, does the states have anything to say about that for the national security too?
I can try to paint a portrait, but I definitely welcome other policy experts like Céline to jump in. AI is regulated in mostly, I would say, from a sectoral way. So there's already, a regulatory landscape, whether it's at a national or regional level, that regulates other activities like privacy or healthcare, or all the other kinds of areas where AI is being deployed. And so if for some reason AI could have a negative impact on areas that have these regulations, that's where it would currently be regulated in a way. But if you go beyond that and look at the technology itself, it's very weakly regulated. So the example of the European Union proposal for AI is very new and it hasn't been implemented. It's just a proposal. It's been a few years. And so in the deployment of technologies more broadly, we're in a place where other laws could be applied and have been applied in certain cases. But more broadly, we're in a space where we are currently in the process of regulating AI, and that's happening at different levels. So different countries are trying to think about different AI systems and developing their own regulations. At a regional level, different regional entities might think about it and develop, like the European Union will develop something that applies to its member countries. The UN would not have the authority to regulate in terms of have very, very strong enforcement of AI regulations. But what it would do after it developed the UNESCO recommendations, it could develop an international convention, which then member states would sign. And then that would kind of identify how, for example, a risk-based or a values-based approach, how these technologies should be used. So that's kind of the, briefly and in a non-legal scholar way, the way in which I would explain how AI is regulated from a country perspective. The UN is always outside of that in the sense because it's operates as its own international organization that can't be regulated by national governments or even regional governments. So as an international organization, the UN has to regulate itself. And so that's where we've talked about interagency standards, which is a form of regulation, of internal regulation. There's also other documents, legal documents that are drawn up by the General Assembly, for example, that might explain how it expects the UN and other international organizations like the World Bank to act. And so that's where the AI systems would be regulated at that level. And so it's always complicated. There's a lot of different levels, and there'll never be one central rule that applies to all the different jurisdictions. But it's definitely something that's evolving and discussing, and that evolving quite quickly, and a lot of people are discussing, and that's why we're talking about it today.
Thank you. I will take maybe the last question, and it will be the question from Caleb. And I'm sorry, Mohamed, maybe you can read or respond to his question in the chat, Eleanor and Robert. Caleb, his question is about how do we promote adherence to AI ethics amongst data scientists who work outside the humanitarian sector but can have access and use publicly available humanitarian data for AI solution? Maybe. one of you could just reply, and then we will close.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I actually have to say, going back to kind of the reason why IOM in particular were interested in kind of putting some thoughts about how kind of humanitarian data should be handled is a lot of it is because I've been in a few events in the build up to 2018 in DTM, along with another data source called ACLED, which is the security incident database, were quite often the two most commonly used kind of data sets in forecasting and other kind of projects. So we were somewhat maybe a bit naive or maybe a bit unaware of how widely our data was being used kind of beyond the traditional humanitarian actors. So as soon as we work very hard to collect our data, to make it high quality, to make it actionable, because it needs to inform actions such as where to help kind of guide where humanitarian aid needs to happen, to make it interoperable and well structured, and to make it accessible. So so we kind of do all that, we make it put it online, but then obviously it's beyond that. So I think and that's a bit, and so the open data movement has kind of been widely adopted by the humanitarian sector, and I that's a good thing. But obviously with that, it means that people outside the sector can use your data. So I think I'd ask it, so developing kind of like ethical ways to operate, providing guidance, particularly emphasizing the kind of humanitarianness of the data and how to kind of follow the humanitarian operations is key. And that's why I think that education about kind of the principles on humanitarian principles as well as human rights is a key aspect. Obviously, that being said, we don't publish anything. You won't find any kind of personal information on these kind of common websites, but obviously more and more, but that being said, if you put a load of data sets together, obviously sensitivities may be kind of identified. So giving these kind of ethical frameworks and giving these kind of routes and processes that people who are outside the sector, who may not be fully engaged in it, but they should have kind of like a way of working with it, in my opinion. And that's kind of what we were trying to do with the initial development of the framework.
Thank you all. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Eleonore. It was a great pleasure to have you both, guys. It was really super interesting, and as you can see, everybody was very happy to hear you. It was a great pleasure. Thank you. Take care, and see you soon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.